That the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
Hello, and welcome to the podcast at the intersection of faith and fear, where every week we discuss what scares us in order to find what saves us. This is the fear of God. Speaking to you right now is one of your hosts, Nathan Rouse. And typically with me is fellow co-host Reed Lackey. And he was here a minute ago, but he just had he was in a hurry. He was trying to get out the door. He had to get out to get the newest issue of Orithia Blue. So hopefully he gets that. I know it's picking up from the last issue. There's going to be some good stuff happening in that comic. We are fans of comic books around here, specifically that one. Hopefully, while he was out, he did wear a mask. Okay. In the meantime, allow me to welcome you to a very special episode of the Fear of God. Not only is this the very first meeting of the Fear of God book club, this week we are going to be featuring Lovecraft Country by author Matt Ruff, and soon to be a series on HBO this August. But not only are we talking about the book Lovecraft Country, we are also talking to the author himself. That's right. Matt Ruff, author of Lovecraft Country, as well as other works like Bad Monkeys, The Mirage, and most recently 88 Names, is going to be featured on this very episode. But I am getting ahead of myself, because here at the Fear of God, we explore, we don't explain. Except for now, when I explain that you can listen to the Fear of God at your nearest podcast platform, now including Pandora. I got that email about 2 hours ago. You can watch the Fear of God on YouTube, and you can browse the Fear of God on the web at thefearofgodpodcast.com, where you'll find episode archives and merch, including cell phone cases, t-shirts, campaign buttons, face masks. Thank you, David Pooler. We're going to throw your face in the face mask up all over the place, but that ain't right on your face. It's awesome. Magnets, pillows. Riri, welcome. Oh, hello, Rafiki. That is unexpected. Look at that room. Did your room barf Disney? Oh. Wow. Yeah, that's
on the day we arrive on the planet, blinking, step into the sun.
just do it. Get out of your seat. Keep going. More to see.
I could do it.
It can never be seen. More to do
than can ever be done.
I'm not going to go for the high note. That was an unexpected way to have you on, but I'm glad you're here. You are
with my friend.
You're not in your typical geography, it looks like. Did you with the Disney parks closed, did you kind of secret your way into the park just after hours? Not after hours, because there are no hours right now. Like,
that would have been
there
great.
On site.
No, but I'm in the next best place. I am in the home of my beloved wife's beloved parents, and they have a room, as you can see, completely dedicated to all things Disney and Disneyland, with particular attention to Goofy. You're going to see, Goofy's right here, in a little like foam cradle. He's also behind me. Yeah. And with a lamp, and so yeah, you're just surrounded by what you don't see, and would be far too cumbersome for me to sort of like turn the camera around. Is I'm also sitting at a desk that has very much more paraphernalia, including lots of little like toys and Disney display, and so it's really quite delightful. This is I
like it. That seems like a happy place.
I have a feeling that I'm now going to have to justify driving up here every single time that we record a session, because now I'm spoiled. So yeah, there's that.
Well, welcome to Disney Room. In the interest, Riri, of getting to our time with Matt Ruff, which I have, little birdie told me that's a good time coming.
That's true.
Shall we go ahead and read the business section today? Oh, wait, hang on. Beetlejuice.
Find a job. Let's see, business section. Ooh la la, what do we got here?
Yes, yeah, I mean, it's like, again, I just default to the Palpatine hands,
Yeah,
So
exactly.
yes, speaking of business time, these are your calls to action for this episode. We still want your email so you can still get your stickers. We already sent out a big crop of those. It's awesome. Been seeing you guys post those to the socials. Emails for stickers. We want your email address. We are not above bartering for it. So go to the website where it says subscribe, put your email there and hit subscribe. And we'll be checking that, and you will be getting, someone asked after this began, like, well, how do you know where to send it? So you subscribe, we see that, I email you, you give me your address, I send you a sticker. Easy. You get a sticker.
Done.
You get to throw it. Thanks for all of you who've been throwing them on your computers and on your, some other places people have been throwing their stickers.
All that.
Really tell from the picture. But yeah, emails for stickers read. So if they get their sticker and they take a picture of it on whatever they've put it on, and
Sure.
they post it to their socials tagging us, what might happen in that scenario?
It's something really amazing, because as you have been hopefully paying attention to, listeners, is that in just a few moments you are going to be privy to a conversation that Nathan and I had with the author of Lovecraft Country, the novel, Matt Ruff. It's a really fun conversation. We think you're going to have a really good time. But wait, there's more. If you do what Nathan suggested and take a picture of the Fear of God sticker and post that to your social media feed and tag us in it, it doesn't have to just be the sticker. You could share the show. You could share an episode. You could just mention the show. You just share it to your public socials and tag us in it, and then you will automatically be entered into an opportunity to win an autographed copy of Lovecraft Country by Matt Ruff himself. So there's not much time left to do that. If you're listening to this, you only have a week left to do that. We will be announcing who won that autographed copy of Lovecraft Country next week. So share whatever you want to about the show to the social media feeds, and yeah, it automatically enters you in. It's great.
If for some reason you don't want to subscribe and share your sticker, or maybe you've already shared your sticker, you can share a review, share an episode. Sure. Go to the website, pull up the episode that you like, and post that link to your socials and be like, I love these guys in this
Absolutely
episode. We love it. You will get an entry for you'll get an entry to win a signed copy of Lovecraft Country, which having read the book is excellent and worth your time.
Wonderful.
And your reach to try to get a signed copy. The last call to action here is, once more, the audience, what you're watching, reading, listening to. We have got several of those in so far. We are trying to build a fun database, if you will, of your renditions, your variations. These are fun. This is a lot of fun. I love what has been coming in, and want you guys to be able to enjoy it as well. Like Bono says, I can't sing, but I got soul. So if you can't sing, don't worry about that. It's not about your skill as a singer. It's about your soulfulness and your willingness to let us hear it. So get your best friend, get your best enemy, get your neighbor, get your your spouse, your kids, the neighbors in your cul-de-sac, whoever. Use the voice memo recorder or something equally easy and email it to the Fear of God podcast. Where do they email it to? Fear of God podcast at gmail.com, not the. If you're emailing it, it's fearofgodpodcast at gmail.com. We will use it on the show, and we will credit you. Reed, do you want to send our friend out? That's all I got for call to action.
Disneyland, Disneyland, Disneyland.
It's showtime.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it is. All right.
Do you know? Do you know?
Do I?
You don't. Before everything, we had already, by we I mean my family had, well, by we I mean my wife and I had already begun, because when we went to Disney back in October for my birthday,
yes,
we didn't take the littlest of our crew. And because I am selfish and I'm that parent who is like, I don't want to parent my 3-year-old at Disney World, who was 2 at the time. And so we had started hashing this idea and looking at dates to take her for like an extended weekend in November or whatever. And then the world fell apart. And now I don't know what is going to happen, if anything, related to that. Regardless.
You could bring her here if you want to.
I could. But that also requires a flight, which feels riddled with its own sort of share of, whatnot. All right. Riri, do you have anything left to offer the listeners before we
No, no, just buckle up. Matt Ruff is just a fantastic conversationalist. We talk about a variety of different things. We talk about, sort of get to know him a little bit. He unpacks his certain aspects of his novel in detail in terms of what the mind and imagination was behind certain key things. So if you've read the novel, I think you'll find it endlessly fascinating. If you haven't read the novel and want to get a flavor for what it's like, I think it's really great, although beware there are a few mild spoilers in our conversation. Just buckle up, sit back. It's a great, fun conversation, and listen to me and Nathan get to know and talk about Lovecraft Country with Matt Ruff.
We'll be right back after this commercial break. Welcome back, everybody. We are very excited for the conversation we're going to be having today because we get to talk to author Matt Ruff. Matt is the author of numerous novels, namely Set This House in Order, which marked a critical turning point for him after it won the James Tiptree Jr. Award, a Washington State Book Award, and a Pacific Northwest Booksellers Association Award. His fourth novel, Bad Monkeys, also won multiple awards and is currently in development with Margot Robbie attached to star. His most recent release is the futuristic virtual reality geopolitical thriller. That's a mashup if ever there was one, 88 names. But it is his sixth novel, Lovecraft Country, being produced as an HBO series set to debut in August that we are primarily going to be talking to him about today. Ladies and gentlemen, friends and foggers, welcome to the Fear of God podcast, author Matt Ruff. Matt, thank you so much for being here.
Well, thanks for having me, guys. It's a lot of fun. Good to see you.
Of course, likewise. Hope you're doing well in Seattle or thereabouts. And
yep, Seattle.
So something we like to do, Matt, every time we have a new guest. So it's possible, and fingers crossed, perhaps you will return to us at some point. But something we like to do when someone is a first timer is a little, sort of game, sort of thing we call two questions.
Real creative with our titles around here.
We are. It is. It's very obtuse. Yes. So Matt, you are, as I just outlined with 88 names, you're a man of many genres. But here on the show, we skew pretty directly into horror. Lovecraft Country itself has a pretty specific horror flavor to it. And I'm just curious, and this is question one of two questions, is would you say there are horror films or stories that you would point to as favorites, or maybe ones that got you plugged into the genre? Just, some favorites.
My entry, I grew up in New York City, and I was what they used to call a latchkey kid. My folks both worked, and they worked in different boroughs. My dad was a chaplain in Downstate Medical Hospital in Brooklyn, and my mother was a translator for Lutheran World Relief in Manhattan. So from a very early age, I was kind of on my own. I, saw myself to school and back, and I had a lot of free time at home so I would watch a lot of TV, and my introduction to horror was the sort of Hammer Film and other black and white rerun films that they would play on, WPIX, independent TV, and stuff like, I have a very fond memories of the Abbott and Costello Universal Monster crossover films that they did, which were, comedy, but they still managed to be scary as well. This was also the era of Eric von Däniken and In Search Of, and so I did a lot of reading of nonfiction stuff about aliens and Bigfoot and poltergeists and ghost hunters and Amityville horror, and that's the kind of stuff that at that age you think it might actually be true, and so it's actually scarier than the stuff that is fiction. I think the first scary film I ever saw in a theater was Jaws.
All right.
And that was also one of the first films I went to see because I actually wanted to. Like, I tagged along with my parents before that, but the kinds of things they like to see, I would often fall asleep. And this one, I got really excited, and after that started to go see films on my own. And my parents were conservative Christians. My mother in particular, she did have some strong ideas about things that kids shouldn't see, but her idea of taboos were not necessarily what you would expect. Like, I remember having big arguments over whether I could go see Oh God, that was a comedy with John Denver and
George Burns.
John Denver and George Burns. It's rated PG, but my mother was convinced this was going to be blasphemous, and so I was weeks trying to get her to let me go see this, and it was only after a coworker told her, no, it's actually quite respectful of religion, that I was able to go see it. So she had these rules, but she was also very busy and not necessarily always that attentive. And meanwhile, some of my other friends' parents were much more open-minded about, they basically take us to see anything. So I learned that if I, just didn't tell my mother what I was going to see, maybe didn't pick the movie until I was out of the house, I could get my friend Paul Anderson or Tony Malari's mom to take us to see anything we wanted, including stuff that today would be considered very scandalous. So one that stands out was Andy Warhol's Frankenstein in 3D, which
oh wow,
yeah, if you haven't seen it, it's a horror porn movie. I think it was originally rated X. I must have seen a cut down version that was R, because I couldn't have been more than 11 or 12 years old when we went to see this. And this is a movie. It's even in the R version. It's there's graphic violence in 3D,
oh,
nudity.
wow.
Simulated necrophilia, and
Goodness gracious.
But
hey,
it was
Reed, when are we going to
very-
cover that one?
Next week, everybody, stay tuned. Next week.
And Matt's
well,
back.
it was a looking back at it, this was a very pure experience in some ways, because I was aware that what I was seeing was shocking, and I was shocked, but I didn't really have the moral framework or vocabulary to know how I was supposed to feel. So I just sort of felt it. And because, you don't, Luther's catechism just doesn't cover this.
I'm sure it was much more visceral. Yeah.
I'm sure it's not just Luther's.
So the way that, that sort of what that left over to me was I guess the lasting impact that had on me was just that to this day, I don't really ever feel that much moral outrage at the content of what I watch or what I read. I have no problem making moral judgments about the characters or what they're doing, but as far as what the filmmakers or the writers choose to include, the question for me is always, are they doing something creative or interesting with it? Because that was the other weird thing about the 70s, was that it was this weird period in between the fall of the old Hays Code and the establishment of new modes of censorship. I mean, there was a rating system, but within that, you could pretty much do whatever the heck you wanted. And unfortunately, what most people chose to do with this creative freedom was just shock value. It's like, let's think of something gross that hasn't been filmed before and film it, and that's our movie. And the novelty wears off really quickly. Like the first time you see someone's head explode on screen, maybe, Scanners or Dawn of the Dead, which I saw when I was 13, 14, you're like, oh my God, that guy's head blew up. But then, the second time it's like, yeah, I've seen that special effect. So
been there, done that. Yeah.
what I always look for is, like, if they're going to violate a taboo, I'm less concerned about that than are they doing it and doing something cool and interesting, or at least, that some thought went into it.
Sure.
And in terms of the specific kinds of horror I like to watch, if I list some of my favorite horror films, the scenario that keeps coming back to me is the idea of taking a small group of people and having them go into some isolated situation that they know is going to be dangerous, or that quickly becomes apparent is very dangerous, and where the sensible thing would be to turn right around and leave, but they either don't or can't, but often they choose not to. And the remainder of the film is a slow unpacking of what a terrible, terrible decision that was. And that's like my classic horror scenario. And I can, and Jaws is a good example of that, where it's like, yes, 3 guys on a little boat in this vast ocean, and the shark shows up, and Roy Scheider, speaking for the audience, is like, we need a bigger boat.
Exactly.
We should go back, get reinforcements. And Quint is like, nah, I'll put a few barrels in him. He won't be able to go down. We'll bring him in.
We'll be fine.
And no, that's not how it works out. And another thing, I'm not really a big fan of shock value. I tend to prefer unless it's done with cleverness, but it's often just the most lazy option. I like the thing where you can see the monster coming, but it doesn't help. Like, that the only way to run, like Michael Myers is the perfect monster. The best thing about Halloween is that he never runs. He's like, he's across the street. Laurie Strode's already on the front porch, pounding on the door, and he's just taking his time. He's like, yeah, Laurie Strode, you go inside. I'm going to get there and it won't matter. That kind of thing, or just some reversal where you slowly realize that it's even worse than you expected, that maybe there's one room in the haunted house where you thought the ghost couldn't go, or the slasher couldn't find you, and then at the last minute you realize, no, that's based on you misunderstanding something earlier in the film. Actually, it could come in whenever it wanted, it just didn't choose to yet, and now you're screwed.
Right.
So those are the kinds of things I love and grew out of this. And then within that too, just, if somebody wants to break a taboo or do something especially perverse, but in a way that makes me feel like, it's more than just shock value, they're trying to do something unique and original with it, then I'll love that too.
It's cool. You're making me think, and I do want to focus on the next question, but I was going to pitch in a few minutes to our listeners to check out the transcription of your lecture from 2010, An Interesting Moral Education, which I read and is really lovely. But in that, there's a note you make where it just says, you really can write about anything if you pull it off. And I just really loved that. And Reed and I don't know how much this history you're aware of, or I alerted you to before this, but Reed and I have been friends for 20 years. So we've had these conversations about storytelling and film and all of its various expressions for that amount of time. And so we're big fans of that idea. And I mean, heck, you talk about sort of breaking taboos. We are the podcast where people of faith talk about horror material. And fortunately, we haven't had too many haters out there, but every now and then it happens. Now,
they don't last long.
Yes, it doesn't last long. The second question is, Matt, what scares you? Now, this can be really superficial. I'll let Reed, if he wants to, talk about his.
No.
Okay, I'm not.
Move on.
Or it can be super existential, kind of however you want to interpret that. What scares Matt Ruff?
I mean, again, I think it's that sense of doing something that is dangerous, where there's that idea that I'm going into the darkest part of the forest, and I know I shouldn't, but I'm going to do it anyway, and I'm not going to turn back, and I'm not going to turn back, and I don't know if this is a holdover of just being a kid on my own and growing up in New York, and at a time when you really could ride the subway when you were 10 and nobody would call the police, but just sometimes you would wander into a situation or a neighborhood or be on a subway platform and you'd realize, geez, this is kind of creepy and I'm in a weird situation. What am I going to do? And sometimes the only way to deal with that was just keep going and hope nothing happened. And I think that kind of stuff, that probably has to do with why I love that kind of horror scenario of, we're going to go out and look for the shark on a little boat, or we're going to go to look for this lost platoon of soldiers at this place, and when we figure out that they've turned into ghosts and we're going to be ghosts too soon, we're not going to leave, let's spend the week at Hill House where you can't leave after dark because the gates are locked, and that kind of thing. I think that combination of knowing that you're in a dangerous place and knowing that even the places you think are safe probably won't be for long, and watching the slow disintegration of the little society of people you've got as people start to turn on each other and break, and you see who's going to freak out first. That's the stuff that really gets under my skin. And again, startlement, yes, I'm scared by things leaping out at me, but what I'm really scared by is that there's no place to run and I can see it coming. And like that movie It Follows that came out recently, that's just a perfect scenario. It's like, you see it coming, you know where it is for a minute, and maybe if you get in a car or jump on a plane, you can put some distance between yourself, but the whole time I would be trying to calculate, like, how many hours do I have before I have to start watching again?
Right.
Sure. Sure.
And that I guess too, the other big thing, of course, is death. The idea that that it's sooner or later, and it's always getting sooner. I'm going to have to face that and see what comes next, if there is anything, and and maybe nothing. And I do the math on that too. When somebody famous dies, and I'm like,
it follows. Yeah.
So and so died. They were 63. So if that was me, how much time would I have left? And it's
Yeah.
That's wild. That's wild. Well, thank you for sharing those thoughts on our two questions. So we're going to do another little fun exercise that Reed and I usually do solo here, but what we're not going to do is sing with a guest because we do have a little ditty that goes along with this segment that we've actually been crowdsourcing our listeners to provide their own renditions of. And so we're going to do that one real quick with one we used a couple weeks ago.
What you watching, what you reading, what you listening to.
That's so great. So yes, what you watching, what you're reading, what are you listening to? Reed, why don't you go first? Do you have a thing you've been watching, that you've been reading, or that you have been listening to?
So I did. Listeners will know because the series picks back up with season 2 on this show next week. But we have been. I did bring my wife into The Leftovers, and nice. So we are as of this recording, we are midway through season 2, and she basically is like, "Yep, I'm frustrated, but I'm hooked." And so the other small one that I'll mention, because that's what we've been watching, been making our way through the Marvel movies, and I've been watching Star Trek too. But I am so excited. As of this recording, the new Bob Dylan album releases tomorrow. And so I've only been listening to the first couple of tracks, but it's his first album of new material in almost a decade, and I'm super excited because I have the day off tomorrow. So I plan on waking up and getting my breakfast and sitting out on the patio and listening to the new Bob Dylan CD. And that is such a delightful.
That is like the textbook Reed Lackey activity you just described. I mean, it really is.
It really is.
If you're gonna have chips and salsa too, that's gonna finish it.
I should take another run at The Leftovers. I started watching that. My wife and I got through, I think, the first 4 episodes and just kind of fizzled out. And I think,
you should give it another
try. It's a timely one for our moment.
It is almost too timely at times that it gets a little uncomfortable with some of the crossover sort of thematic, obviously not narrative, but some of the crossover thematic intersections are a bit eerie, if you will.
Read to your Dylan note. I was listening to one of the kind of pop culture entertainment podcasts I enjoy, and Dylan just did some interview. Was it Hollywood Reporter?
Oh my God, yes.
Yeah, well, that's what I was going to say. Is this person, they referenced how on their staff, the Dylan person, in other words, the you of this staff, cited that as the best interview he's ever done.
It was staggering because normally, I mean, I don't want to camp here long, but like normally Dylan has a reputation for like toying with interviews and putting on a persona and not really being very sincere. He's always given, like, one of my favorite little jokes. They riffed on it in the film I'm Not There, but somebody was like, "Hey, do you have a word for your fans?" And he turned around and went, "Astronaut." And then got in the got in the car. So I mean, he always like puts on this little persona, but this is an honest to God conversation. He answers without pretense and without facetiousness, and seems to sort of be speaking from the heart. And yeah, I mean, it was mind blowing to have such a lengthy article with him apparently giving no persona whatsoever. It's a great.
That's cool.
Article. Yeah,
That's
really
cool.
Great article.
Maybe this will be maybe this will be the moment I finally, kind of jump on the bandwagon.
I do love that album.
Matt, what about you, sir? Is there anything specific you want to talk about that you've been watching, reading, and or listening to?
Well, my wife and I have been binge watching Justified, which is an amazing show. Late night, I watched. My wife is not a horror fan, so I tend to do my horror watching late at night. In terms of new stuff, I've sort of been slowly discovering Indian cinema. As like Netflix, as it is desperate to maintain a catalog as like other streaming services yank away stuff from them. One of the things they've been doing is a lot of Indian films. There's a a mini series called Sacred Games, which if you've got Netflix is worth checking out. It's really crazy and hard to describe, but just give it an episode and you'll get caught up. It's really good.
And it's horror themed?
That one is more of it's about this gangster who dies he gets killed in the first episode, but he tells this policeman that he's got 25 days before Bombay is going to be destroyed. And he's got that much time to figure out, but it's very cryptic, and the rest of the story is cut between the present day of the cop trying to figure out what this is and how to stop it, and the backstory of the gangster and how he came to know this and how he came to reveal this secret. And it's just this Matt Johnson, who recommended it to me, just said this is batshit crazy, and that's really the only way to describe it.
Yeah, right.
In a horror thing that I saw that's also, it's not as good as Sacred Games, but it's called Ghoul. It's a 3-part miniseries for Netflix. I need to
get to that one. Yeah, and
yeah, it's set in, I think, an unnamed country that's Christian majority and Muslim minority, and God, I'm forgetting her name, but I think it's Radka Apted or something like that. But she's an actress. She plays this junior intelligence officer who, she's Muslim, but she turns in her own father as a subversive, so they decide to trust her, and she's brought basically to this, what's essentially a torture center, a black site, and they are bringing in this notorious criminal, this notorious terrorist, and they've got like one night to break him. And the thing is, he's possessed.
Oh, wow.
So she's like she's a true believer, and she's like, she turned in her dad because she honestly believed it was the right thing to do, and I didn't realize that she's like, she believes in this stuff, that in this corrupt state, and most of the other people there are just monstrous people. But anyway, yeah, so it's this torture center, and they bring in a bigger monster than themselves, and
wow,
then it gets interesting. And it's just, that's really good. And in the theme of people going into a scary place that they should know better, there's a movie called Ritual that's also on Netflix that is 4 guys taking a ramble in the mountains, good. And take a shortcut through the woods that is not a shortcut.
No, there's a lot of cutting, but nothing geographically short about that one. Awesome. Well, I will just throw as a coda here for us. So I did, my kids are out of town for the week, which is as relaxing as it is stressful in the current environment in which we find ourselves. But I've got more time on my hands than I would have otherwise. And so yesterday morning, I read to your get up and have your coffee and listen to Dylan straight through. I got up and had my coffee, and my wife sat at her desk, and I went downstairs and watched The Five Bloods on Netflix, Spike Lee's new film.
I haven't made it to that one yet. I want to.
Yeah. So at like 9 a.m., I'm like, I'm going to just cue this up, and just, it took a little longer because I had to field a few, miscellaneous distractions, but, and in fact was ready, because it's 2.5 hours, was ready for the possibility of kind of pausing it kind of midway and sort of resuming later, but made it all the way through. It's very compelling. I'm a Spike Lee appreciator. I wouldn't call myself a devotee, but just partly because I don't have all of his catalog consumed at this point, but was thoroughly engaged by it. It's got some tonal shifts that he's relatively known for. That really, there's a mid section where kind of the energy ramps up pretty substantially. I would highly recommend it. And nice. I did not know this until today. You're going to like this pivot. I read Lovecraft Country for our conversation, but I intentionally avoided I had initially seen the first trailer right when it came out, but had forgotten much of it. And then today went to the IMDb page to kind of look up what's going on and the cast and stuff. So Jonathan Majors, who played Atticus in the HBO Lovecraft, is a featured player in The Five Bloods, and he's great. I was unfamiliar with his work, and so it was very cool to see him.
He's an amazing actor and also a really sweet guy. I got to meet him on the set.
That's cool.
That's awesome.
Well, we're going to get to some of that, but that has been another installment of
What you watching, what you reading, what you're listening to.
That is amazing.
It's so cute.
Thank you for participating in what you watch and read and listening to, Matt. So what we're going to do now is, so we're primarily here to talk about Lovecraft Country. It is true. But you have a more recent work that has come out, and as a brief sort of insight to how you even ended up here right now with us, longtime friend of the show, Blake Collier, is a peer of yours and featured you, or I don't exactly know the genesis of the podcast version of your most recent work, or at least that unpacked a lot of the themes of it. But you released a book called 88 Names. He had been talking to us about that book for a little while. And so when the time came to kind of have this conversation, I wanted to make sure you had the opportunity to sort of pitch, and you'll love this. The other night, I was trying to tell my wife, and I, in deference here, it is through Blake that I came to know your work. And so right now I've only read Lovecraft Country, but I know enough about 88 Names to kind of have a handle on it, but I was trying to describe it to her, and I was like, yeah, I don't know how to distill this, because
some of my novels are like, yeah, I can do the elevator pitch in one line, and sometimes it gets more complicated. And of course, the problem is all the books are different. I've kind of been fortunate to be able to do whatever I want and basically step in a different genre each time. So,
well, if you don't mind, throw in, because I did listen to a little bit of your conversations with Blake, and I loved, and if you can, at least in brief, because it pivots into not just 88 Names, but several others. Talk about the Epiphany, if you don't mind, where you were referencing to him, kind of this idea of the confluence of ideas. Does that make sense? Is that ringing a bell for you?
So yeah, an epiphany is a word for a false epiphany. It's something that initially referred to thing experienced by schizophrenics, where they see connections between things that aren't related. But it's basically now it's just come to refer to any misfiring of human pattern recognition. It's what creates conspiracy theories, where if for some reason you see the number 23 in the paper, and then you happen to notice the number 23 on the clock, and you're primed for that, you can go through your day and you will notice multiple instances of the number 23. Or if maybe you see an elephant, a cloud shaped like an elephant, and then you come home and Dumbo maybe is playing on is on TV.
Sure.
And they're just themes like that. And rationally, this stuff is not connected, it's just coincidence, but because your mind makes these connections, you add significance to it. And so that's what an epiphany is. And as a writer, it's actually a very useful creative tool that I have epiphanies all the time, where I can take ideas or bits of business that you would think shouldn't fit together and figure out a way to build a story out of them. It's like, okay, well, what if I did this, but then I added this to it, and then this happened? And to me, it makes perfect sense that these things should fit together. But
sure.
So like my second novel, Sewer, Gas, and Electric, it grew out of partly a desire to do a satire of Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged, and partly as a reaction to the weird subset of Black supporting characters in the movie Die Hard. I just noticed that they had there's a type of character in films called the amusing black man. It's like the minor black sidekick who's there to sort of fill the diversity quota, and and he's usually funny, but he's only on for a couple of lines. And what was weird about Die Hard is that they had like 5 of them. They had all of these different characters, and it was like they were trying really hard to diversify the cast, but the problem was all of the good roles were already taken.
Wow. Yeah.
So it just, to me at least, it just sort of underscored the fact that, yeah, if you want to make a movie that's diverse or with a substantial Black character, you've got to start thinking about that before you cast the leads, not after.
Right.
So that kind of somehow I found a way to put that into this novel with Ayn Rand. And then the whole thing actually started because I'd been thinking about what was the weirdest title for a trilogy that you could come up with that might theoretically be a good story. And so I was like wandering through the fantasy section, looking at the Lord of the Rings books and the Shannara books, and then I just started riffing on trilogy titles, like the exclamation point, question mark, ampersand trilogy. And the only one that
Sign
stuck
me
was
up.
this one with the three utilities, and only because that sort of vaguely suggested some idea of a story. And if you're thinking to yourself, how the heck do all these things fit together? Congratulations. This is exactly how
That's the work.
I'm able to answer that question, and that's how I get paid. So anyway, 88 Names is actually a bit more straightforward than that. It's set about 20 years in the future at a point when, virtual reality technology has finally matured to the point where, everybody's got their home VR rig. And the protagonist, John Chu, is what is known as a Sherpa, which is a paid guide to online role-playing games. And basically, if you have a real life, a real job, you don't have 200 hours to devote to building up, your World of Warcraft character, you can pay him a fee and he will provide you with a ready-made high-level character with cool weapons and armor and a bunch of player teammates who know what they're doing and will basically cater a night's adventure for you. And because this is a violation of the terms of service of most of these games, one of the things that often happens is that while they're conducting these adventures, they will occasionally get busted by the EULA police, the end user license agreement police within the game world. So part of the cost of doing business that periodically their accounts get banned. So he has multiple accounts, and it's just like breakage. You run a supermarket, a certain amount of pickles will get, pickle jars are going to get broken. You just factor that in. So one account gets banned, he switches to another. So he's got 88 names. And one day he gets a new client who goes by the name of Mr. Jones, who claims to be a famous, wealthy person with powerful enemies and is willing to pay $100,000 a week for a comprehensive tour of the world of virtual reality gaming. And it's one of those too good to be true kind of deals, but he's willing to pay the first week's installment up front and the money's real. So John Chu takes the job. But as the tour gets underway, he begins to suspect that Mr. Jones is actually Kim Jong-un.
Nice. All right.
Who's interested in, virtual reality for nefarious reasons. And the first 2/3 of the novel are set entirely, except for flashbacks, are set entirely in one or another virtual reality environment, either an actual game or in a virtual chat room. So all of the characters have total control over how they look and sound, and machine translation works to a point where you can pass yourself off as a native speaker of a language you've never studied. And almost everyone John Chu is interacting with, not just Mr. Jones, but his coworkers and even his ex-girlfriend Darla, because cyber sex is also a thing. These are all people he's never met in real life. And
all right.
Sometimes he has names, he can look them up, their Facebook page, but Facebook pages can be fake too. So it's this constant guessing game of who am I really dealing with and what do they really want. Basically, yeah, he's dealing with people he doesn't necessarily know. And so the novel is this combination cyber thriller and an exploration though of identity and of also the difficulty of having relationships with people in online, and when people
Sure.
can lie about themselves. And then it's also sort of the closest thing to a romantic comedy that I'm ever going to write, probably. My wife has been telling me for years to, you should write a romantic comedy. And this is definitely not what she had in mind, but it kind of fits the bill. It's just a twisted romantic comedy. So
that's awesome.
yeah, that's 88 Names.
That's very exciting. So listeners, once you are done with Lovecraft Country, make 88 Names your summer reading. I know I am intrigued. Speaking of Lovecraft Country, let's pivot that direction. And
Sure.
Matt, you have Blake to thank for this moment where he wanted me to make sure you ask Matt about his confusion around Jordan Peele wanting to adapt the story. I have no idea what that is a reference to, so I'm just reading it. And if you know what Blake is talking about, feel free to fill us in on what that is referring to as we begin our trek towards Lovecraft Country.
Sure. So for those people who don't know, so Lovecraft Country was actually the original idea. I actually pitched this as a potential TV series back in 2007. And the idea was that it was going to be the X-Files if Mulder and Scully were black travel writers living in the 1950s. It was going to be about a family who own a travel agency, black family who own a travel agency in Chicago and publish a fictional version of the Green Book called the Safe Negro Travel Guide. And the main character is the son of the family, Atticus Turner. His uncle, George Barry, is the guy who owns the travel agency. And Atticus ends up working as a sort of field researcher for this Safe Negro Travel Guide. So his job is to drive around the country looking for places that will accept Black customers, will take his custom. And at the same time, Atticus and his uncle George are both huge nerds. So they're big fans of weird tales and other genre fiction at a time when genre fiction didn't love them back, basically. And so it's partly about the difficulties of being a Black nerd. And so they find themselves drawn into a series of real life weird tales. And at the same time, they've got to deal with the more mundane horrors of legal segregation and Jim Crow racism. And so it's sort of the question of which is the bigger threat to safety and sanity. Is it the thing under the bed, the paranormal monster, or is it just, the white America, basically?
Sure,
and this is kind of how Lovecraft came into it, because I needed a thematic bridge between these two types of horror. And Lovecraft is both cosmic horror and white supremacy. He was very much a vocal white supremacist. So, and once I had that title, I sort of, as part of the story, I built in the idea that there is this cabal of white sorcerers who take an interest in Atticus, because it turns out he's descended on his mother's side from a slave who used to belong to an ancestor of this Braithwaite family, this rich white clan of sorcerers in New England. And it's partly because of their interest in Atticus that all of these other paranormal things start happening to the family. And so in the novel, each chapter is sort of both a standalone episode, and this is again very X-Files, both a standalone episode and part of a larger arc story. And each chapter stars a different member of the extended cast getting a star turn in a different reimagined classic horror novel, or horror story. So there's a chapter where Uncle George has to break into a museum and steal what is essentially a copy of the Cryptonomicon. There's a chapter where Atticus's friend Letitia gets a surprise windfall and decides to buy a house in a white neighborhood, and she gets an incredibly good deal because the house is haunted. So now she's got white neighbors who want to burn her out, and the ghost is white too and doesn't want her there either. And so to keep the house, she's got to play the dead off against the living. There's a chapter where Letitia's sister Ruby goes home with the wrong guy on New Year's Eve and wakes up a white woman. So it's sort of Jekyll and Hyde, and so on. And all of this sort of, again, epiphany fits together into one larger story about this family trying to keep their safety and sanity and get through this together. And
well, and what's really fun about that and then I'll pivot to Reed for some questions for you. But one, you're in great company as an X-Files name dropper here. I'm in
Ned's house.
Yeah. So, the room Reed is in isn't actually Disneyland, viewers, but is his father-in-law's house, and his father-in-law is also an avid X-Files fan, and that's a long-standing bit on the fear of God. But what's really fun, so again, as mentioned, I was unfamiliar with the text of Lovecraft Country before beginning it. And so that first installment with Atticus and the gang going to find Montrose, I thought was the story, like that's the arc of the story, until it resolves. And I was like, oh, okay. And then it reveals itself in this more anthology sort of vein. And I just really appreciated that. But it was funny for a moment.
That throws a lot of people at first, but I had this problem where I had initially imagined it as this open-ended series, TV series. And I had to figure out, okay, when 2007, it was just a little too early for that to work. So I had to figure out, how do I want to do this? How do I make it into a novel? And I realized what I could do is, like, I didn't want to do a collection of short stories, but I also didn't want to jettison the idea of repurposing these old, basically saying what happens if you take these classic tales and imagine them as genre stories that are not hostile to African-American protagonists. And eventually what came to my rescue was binge watching on Netflix and realizing, oh, what I can do, it's not short stories, it's the literary equivalent of a season of TV, a limited miniseries that you binge read. And
Yeah.
And once I had that, I was like, yeah, I can make this work. But that's why it is the way it is. But that, especially that first break, and in the editing, I did some rewriting of the opening of the second chapter just to make it a little easier to make that transition. But a lot of people are caught by surprise by that.
Oh, and I loved it. Ultimately, it was just funny because I was going in.
Oh yeah, no, you think it's going to go on, and then you're like, wait a minute, what's but so. And of course, part of my goal too with the novel was that it could be a proof of concept that, look, this really does work. This is not just going to be like, racist misery of the week. It's going to be, it's not about suffering. It's about, we've got all of these challenges in addition to, dealing with horrors. We've got to deal with just being Black in America, but we've got this guidebook and we've got these skills that have been honed from, we know how to do this.
Sure.
And so it's actually quite hopeful while trying to simultaneously be honest just about how difficult things were. And so as soon as the book came out, it had an unusual amount of interest. And I was hearing from Wyatt Cenac sent me email.
That's awesome.
And I was like, at first I'm like, yeah, Wyatt Cenac, sure. But then I realized, oh wait, maybe that really is Wyatt Cenac. And then, I think one of Spike Lee's cinematographers emailed me too, saying, if you need help getting this pitched in Hollywood, let me know. But it turned out I didn't need help because I was getting all these people were calling my CA agent. And one of the people who contacted him was Jordan Peele. And this was before Get Out. I think he was working on Get Out, but it had not been released or even teased yet. And so my agent gets this phone call and he calls me. He's like, yeah, this is kind of odd because, this guy, Jordan Peele, he's known mostly for comedy, but apparently he's trying to break into horror. And I was like, fine, I'm happy to talk to him, and,
Sure.
And then I found out Misha Green was going to be on the phone call too. And I got even more excited because she'd done Underground, which is basically The Great Escape on a slave plantation. And I'm like,
wow.
Which one thing, she's just really good, but second, she will know how to pitch this so that it won't scare the TV people away.
Sure.
Because she's already done it. And so we got on the phone and we had a great conversation. It was probably the best phone call I've ever had because we were all talking about the same story. They got it. And that's often not the case when you talk to Hollywood. Sometimes it's like, did you read the same book I did? Or they'll have some radical idea like, what if we rip out everything that's interesting about it and do this? And like Jordan and Misha were like, nope, this is great. And then a couple of weeks later, the premiere, the first trailer for Get Out dropped, and I saw that and just started, I was
awesome.
like, okay, now I get it. It's like, this is why we're on the same wavelength. He's doing what I'm doing. It's just he's doing Get Out in the present day. I'm doing it in 54.
Right.
Right.
So, and the other thing that was exciting about that, it was even from the trailer, I could tell that Get Out was going to be it was going to do huge numbers. And that meant it would really grease the skids. And little did I know, I knew it would be a successful movie, but after it blew up, it was basically like, why, yes, Jordan Peele, whatever you want to do next.
Exactly.
And I just happened to be the golden ticket winner on that. So HBO ordered it, and it was like they even skipped the part where they'll do a pilot and then decide. And in this case, they were like, nope, it's Jordan Peele. We'll just do the whole first season. Go ahead, straight to series.
No, that's great.
So I'm still bouncing off the walls about that. But
that's awesome. To your knowledge, Matt, I don't know how much you know, but and maybe it's an unfair question, but are they doing the entire text or just parts of the story? Do you know?
I don't know. It's one of those things where I can't really talk much of what I know.
As I was forming that question, I thought that's dumb to ask.
But also, I honestly, I don't think it will be. I think the arc will be at least, it will be recognizable to people who've read the novel. Even from the trailers, you can sort of tell that, particularly the opening, there's details that are different. It's like it's going to. I think what I'm guessing, it's going to be my story, but told in a parallel universe where it won't just be the same thing twice. And I'm actually kind of excited about that. Because I've told my version of it. I've got it, and now I kind of want to see where Misha's going to take it and what her ideas are. And and already thinking about, if I do want to continue the story myself, continue my literary version, it will be interesting to see whether, as the two narratives diverge, whether that can be made to work. Because generally there is this feeling that there's got to be enough connective tissue. Like, you can't tell the same story twice in two different ways. And I've always wondering, well, why can't you? Why not? Because if the basic source material is rich enough, why can't you do multiple interpretations of it? And the main reason you can't most of the time is because copyright doesn't allow it. You've got, you've only got one authorized version, and then you've got to wait until everyone's dead for 75 years to do it again. But I've seen, a dozen versions of Macbeth, and, some are good, some are bad, but I'm happy to see another one if somebody's got a new twist on it. Scotland, PA, that was great, so yeah, set it in a diner. So I part of me is interested to see if I can make it work with this.
That's very cool.
That's very exciting. So I have, let's dig a little bit deeper into sort of the primary text of Lovecraft Country. And so what I want to say before we get into this piece is, obviously for our listeners, we recommend you read the book. We're going to go ahead and skip to the fact we do, I think, collectively highly recommend that you read Lovecraft Country. Go check it out. I want us to feel the freedom in this conversation to talk about things that would be considered spoilers. So this is a big blanket right now. This is your spoiler warning. So as we proceed, Nathan and I have both read the book. I'm presuming Matt has read it, having written it. And so what we're going to,
still got the text committed to memory in large ways, like this. So yeah.
So what we're going to do is, as we sort of wade through Lovecraft Country in detail, just be aware, if you want to experience it blind, which I did and very much recommend that experience, pause this, go check it out, come back to this conversation. If you want to get a flavor for what it is and don't mind some things being spoiled, then carry on with us. So, but as we do that, so I must confess out the gate, I'm not a very big fan of H.P. Lovecraft. I'm a fan of all kinds of horror. I recognize his place in the canon. I think it's well-deserved in terms of what he's done to cosmic horror, and some of the adaptations of it have been some really interesting films among some of my favorites. But I'm not a very big fan of his prose. So a lot of times when this connection would be brought up to where it was like, oh, Lovecraft is also a white supremacist, and that's a big deal, I was always like, well, okay, I could kind of take or leave the guy, as it were. So sort of my entry question before my next one is, where do you sort of sit in the Lovecraft camp in general, as his fiction? Like, was his fiction really important to you? Was it something where you just respected his place in the canon? Where does that intersection cross over?
So Lovecraft is one of those people. Philip K. Dick is another example where, when I was younger, I actually liked his imitators better than him.
Okay.
I found him boring for a lot of predictable reasons. That the pacing was just too slow. I felt like I didn't appreciate the slow build of dread in him as much as I do now, where because Lovecraft, the thing is, and this is true of most of his best stories, is that the monster either never appears or only shows up on the last page. It's all about that anticipatory dread, and that's really an acquired taste. And as a kid, I was just like, nothing's happening. They're wandering around.
That was me too.
They're wandering around these ruins, and they're using all these big words that I don't really understand. And, and when is something going to happen? And the imitators, I think, the pacing issues were better, and they captured more of that flavor, but did it quicker and more condensed style. When I went back to him, as I got older, I'm more able to appreciate him on his own terms. And the pieces that I like, I think the three I always cite are Mountains of Madness, Call of Cthulhu, and Shadow over Innsmouth. Those work for me. And Shadow over Innsmouth actually is one of the rare exceptions where it does have action sequences. It's like, much of it is this, this guy goes to this seaside town where the locals have been, entered into this unholy pact with these fish aliens that live in the sea, and they're interbreeding. There's this very veiled subtext of fear of, miscegenation and race mixing, though in this case it's a different species, but these locals are devolving, and So anyway, this guy comes to visit, and he sees too much, and the bus that's supposed to take him back to Boston or Kingsport, mysteriously breaks down. And he's forced to spend the night, and as soon as it gets dark, the whole town turns out to come lynch him. So, on the one hand, it's this very racist story, but it's also at the same time a very effective tale of attempted lynching. And it's this guy trying desperately to get out of town before he gets killed. And of course, it's Lovecraft, so it's a white protagonist, but you could tweak it very easily and turn it into a story about a black motorist stranded in a sundown town. And even the way he finally escapes, they're watching all the roads, but he follows the railroad tracks out of town. And we just had the anniversary of the Tulsa massacre, where the white folk of Tulsa, thousands of them, came in and burned down a black neighborhood of Greenwood. And there too, one of the few escape routes that black people had in that neighborhood was following the railroad tracks out of Tulsa. So it's weird to read Lovecraft, and it's like, yep, that's what you do when people are organized to try and murder you. You pick the one road they don't think of. So those stories definitely work for me now in terms of the sense of fear. And then again, it's like I totally get people who just they bounce off the racism hard. Or you have stories like Reanimator, which is Lovecraft's Frankenstein story, and most of it is just kind of good comedic horror, but then he's got this one section where he goes out of his way. They try to reanimate a black man's body, and he goes out of his way to talk about, how the protagonist thinks that the guy looks like a monkey. And it's not it's the narrator is Herbert West's assistant, but the voice is clearly Lovecraft sharing a racist joke that he assumes his reader will appreciate. And I'm sure there are a lot of readers who they get to that and they just want to throw the book across the room, or they get really mad. And my reaction is more just embarrassment for, it's like watching somebody crap themselves in public and think they're being clever. And again, I always go back to that thing of, okay, yeah, I could be mad at you for picking this, but more I just like, what bugs me is just it's so boring as a story choice. It's like you could have done anything and you did this, and why?
Sure. There's I had a comparable. I apologize if I'm cutting you off.
No, go ahead.
I had a comparable situation. Had an intersection with the novels of Dennis Wheatley, particularly there was a novel called The Devil Rides Out that I had seen. I think Hammer had done a version of it starring Christopher Lee, and I really responded very strongly to the film, so I sought out the novel. And it was following my recognition and had come to awareness of people like Lovecraft, who, yes, well-respected name in the horror community. I don't know about respected, but like for his horror tropes.
Oh, yeah,
and
he
then,
definitely is for a lot of people. Yeah,
sure.
Even now.
But then this underbelly of racism. And so then I'm getting into the Dennis Wheatley novels, and suddenly things are pinging for me. Language is pinging for me that I think when I was younger, probably because that just was not something I was sensitive to as a child growing up.
Sure.
It maybe would not have pinged me as deliberately. And that's part of the goal is you try to open yourself up to some awareness as you grow older. And so it's interesting to me now, things just feel different, and there are certain things. And I'm torn in this moment because I really want to get into some more specifics of the text of the book, but I think this is an interesting conversation. If you'd be willing to follow me here.
I'm happy to stay longer. I'm not in a rush. If
Awesome,
your listeners
awesome.
are, I'm happy to hang.
Oh no, listeners have become accustomed to my
they're used to us running long.
So I think there's this big conversation right now that it bleeds out of what is being dubbed as cancel culture. I don't want to have a conversation about cancel culture.
I appreciate, but yeah.
No, I don't want to have a conversation about that. But there is something that I would be interested in, and that is you come to a place to where what you previously loved now has a bit of a different sheen on it because what you have since learned. And how do you move forward hand in hand with the affection you probably still carry for what you loved before, but now see it in a slightly different light, And particularly, I'm interested in two things. How do you appreciate that and move on, if you do, as a reader or movie watcher or whatever? And as a crafter of stories yourself, how do you balance? Because for an inch of context, when you described earlier in the conversation about you had an experience where you just kind of came to accept that you don't pass moral judgments on content. I grew up in a conservative Christian household wherein there were active conversations about the moral content of films and TV shows, et cetera. And so while I sit in a place, obviously, as a co-host on a podcast of faith and horror, I sit in a place very similar to what you described of like, I don't pass moral judgments on the material itself. I more think about it in the context of, did this work? Was this creative? Was it inventive? Was it effective?
Right.
But as a crafter of stories, how do you also engage that sort of potentially, this is a bit of a troublesome area. I'm with my group of friends and we're headed into a dangerous place, but we're not turning around. We're just going to tread forward. If that question makes sense, I'd love to hear you talk about that.
No, it does make sense. And I mean, well, first of all, yeah, I mean, and it's not just white kids either. I mean, this is one of the things I referenced in the acknowledgments, there's a woman named Pam Knowles who wrote a really amazing essay called Shame, where she talks about growing up as a Black nerd and this, you just don't see the racist elements in, she would do this thing where she would watch movies with her dad and he would make fun of, the like, oh, what's this one called? Planet of the White People. And, he would just razz her about, she loved this science fiction genre that very clearly didn't have a place for her. And she just wanted to, be left alone to enjoy her stories. And her dad is like trying to tell her, hey, you're missing this stuff. And the heartbreaking part of the essay is where she talks about going to see Star Wars the first time. And, which was, for nerds of a certain age, was like this religious experience. And that was the moment when she finally got what her dad was trying to tell her. Like, she's watching this, this amazing movie and realizing there's no place for me in this. And so she's simultaneously blown away and heartbroken. And it's like, okay, yeah. And that was something I was trying to capture in Lovecraft Country, where this has always been a thing. It's like, and one of the things about this business with Lovecraft being, is everybody mentioning what a horrible racist he is that I feel in a way that is offering cover to the more general issue that almost everybody, or at least a quite large swath of people in the genre, used racist tropes in a way that would be very noticeable today. So it was like, it's not just Lovecraft was definitely out of the fringes, particularly if you read his letters. He was a sincere believer in a lot of wild stuff, but I had no shortages of examples when I wanted to include something in Lovecraft Country where I took a cherished story and wanted to point out, there's something in here that a Black father worried about what his kid was reading would be able to point to. Like, yes, John Carter of Mars, he fought for the South. He was a Southern captain, and his slaves loved him.
And,
Robert Louis Stevenson, Jekyll and Hyde. Well, turns out Mr. Hyde, he's swarthy. He's not Black, but he's described in a way that it's clear he's meant to be Eastern European or maybe Jewish, but definitely not, a white cool guy like Dr. Jekyll.
Right,
so
right.
So, or even the Tom Swift novels, like, the original versions, I think those have been rewritten several times. They would have incredible stereotypical characters. So it wasn't just Lovecraft. It's just that Lovecraft he really went into the DNA of cosmic horror in particular, so that I laugh when people talk about, well, should we stop reading him? Should we expunge him from the canon? As if you could. I mean, you can't.
Right. Yeah.
So I think it's for that reason, and because people do love him, and because it's still very easy to just turn a blind eye to stuff you don't want to deal with, that you will have people argue with you about, well, was he really that racist? Would you even really notice? And it's like, I use a very obvious example in the novel just because I didn't want to belabor the point, because that the scene where I first talk about Lovecraft's fiction and Atticus's love of fiction, it's more about, Atticus just trying to enjoy his nerdy stuff and his dad giving him a hard time. So I didn't want to spend 20 minutes talking about, like, if you read Lovecraft, it doesn't take long to figure out where he's coming from on this stuff. But but yeah, you would notice this. And I think the best you can do is just, first of all, be honest. Don't deny what's there. But at the same time, I think the hardest thing is just to get past this idea that someone can simultaneously be racist and still be admirable.
Right.
There is this belief, and I think it's a belief white people in particular love to think, is that racists all have horns. It's like, that you can tell somebody's racist because they use racist language all the time, and they wear racist clothes, and they do this and that. And so the idea that somebody can have really, appalling views, or just have kind of racist views or blind spots, and at the same time be someone really clever and creative and admirable at the same time. It's just like, no, it's got to be one or the other. I can't.
Right.
And this is why, it also, if you can't process that, it also makes it very difficult to maintain a relationship with people who are racist without becoming corrupted. Because if you are friends with somebody, it's natural to want to make excuses for everything. And it's very difficult to be someone's friend and appreciates what's good about them, but still, if they start talking nonsense, just be honest with them. Like, come on, that's not true. And it's a very difficult thing, and it's a very difficult thing to be seen to do publicly too, because other people will say, well, why are you still friends with that person when you know what they're like? And it's like, well, I'm trying to change their mind, or they're my family. I'm not going to cut them off, but I'm still going to try and say what I need to say. And, and sometimes you do cut them off because there's just not enough there. But to me, it basically comes down to, am I getting enough out of if it's a story, am I getting enough out of it that's positive, that I don't feel like I'm, slogging through this. Again, I'm not mortally offended. It's just more like, if Lovecraft's fiction were nothing but cheap racist jokes, I would just, it's offensive, but it would just be really tedious. It's
right.
Like,
yeah.
Okay, this is all you got. Fine. And I've read stuff that's much more horrific. Like probably the worst book in my home library, I've still got it somewhere, is the Turner Diaries, which is, it was written by, I think, the head of the Aryan Order. And it's basically, imagine a Tom Clancy novel written from the point of view of an avid white supremacist, someone who really hopes that white folks will, first overthrow the US government, and then basically conduct white genocide around the globe, and wipe out everybody who's not white. That's basically the plot of the novel. And it's supposedly the book that inspired Timothy McVeigh to blow up the federal building in Oklahoma, because there's a scene in the novel very much like that. And I bought it because I'd heard about it, and it was this horrible thing. And so I'm like, oh, this is horribly taboo, and the FBI wants it banned. Let me read this and see what it is. And and sure enough, it's like, once you get past the novelty of reading someone who really seems to believe that it would be great if we could just, poison gas everybody who's not white, there's just nothing there. It's not interesting. There's no. And I had a discussion with Paul Lafarge, who wrote a book called The Night Ocean, which is another book inspired by Lovecraft. And I asked him this question: is there any character who's so loathsome you couldn't see trying to write from their perspective, or you couldn't empathize enough to try and humanize them, whilst obviously still trying to be honest about what they were? And he said, no, there's nobody I don't think I could try to do that with, but there are people who are just in their loathsome, that there's just not enough self-awareness, or make them interesting to write about. It's like, I think the best fictional example I've seen of this is the movie Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer.
Oh, okay. Yeah, right.
It feels very realistic as a portrait of what a serial killer might be like. It's supposedly based on Henry Lee Lucas, but it's just grueling to watch, because he's not a full personality. He kills people and doesn't really have any real emotional affect or connection with anyone else. And so it's not, except in some very clinical sense of feeling like it might be a real snapshot of what somebody like that is like. It's just grotesque and not entertaining. and not, it
Yeah.
doesn't teach you anything. So you don't get anything out of it. So I watched it once and I have no real need to go back to it. And
Have you, so what's interesting, whenever Henry Portrait of a Serial Killer comes up, there was a film that, thanks to the horror streaming service Shudder, recently hit my radar. A film, if I'm saying it in its correct pronunciation, which I'm probably not, is the film Angst. It's like Angst is the name of the film. And if memory serves, it was from like almost a one-time film director. I don't have the information in front of me because I didn't fully prepare to talk about it, but it is made in '88, and it was a bit of a precursor, I think either a precursor or contemporary to Henry Portrait of a Serial Killer, but far more interesting to me in that film, the psychopath narrates the entire film. So you see the inner workings of his brain, or at least he's communicating it as he's going through his sort of monstrous machinations. And in contrast, if you haven't seen that film, I recommend on an evening where you have a bit of a strong stomach, Henry Portrait of a Serial Killer, I kind of saw and I was like, okay, I've seen it. Don't really feel the need to revisit it. Angst I found very compelling, to the degree that, as difficult of a viewing experience as it was, it is, I just love the way you put it earlier. There's a lot of there. There's some very interesting things to sort of move into. And I feel like, to the point you were just making earlier, I mean, in this crazy world that we're living in right now, I won't get into, for obvious reasons, won't get into an incredible amount of depth on this, but even in our own family, our own extended family, we've had to wrestle with those same sort of conversations of, okay, there's some people that what we really want to do is we really want to have an honest to God, human to human conversation about this subject and about why certain statements you make or why certain views you hold could be problematic or could be potentially harmful or could be sort of regressing or reverting the conversation in some ways that you would find appalling if your eyes were only opened to exactly how it is appalling and the way it's appalling. But these are also your family members who you love. And I think there's a degree to which we can hold a lot of that in tension. And I find that again, getting a bit back to your book, I find in general, and I'm certainly not the first person to say this, that science fiction, fantasy, and horror provide some really effective outlets through which to kind of explore those territories in their extremities, which allows us to kind of dance with things that in a straightforward story might be much more difficult to stomach and might be much more difficult to even describe and articulate without coming off too grandiose or heavy-handed or whatever. Horror can kind of provide some context there.
I mean, I know what you're saying. I feel like fiction generally can do that. I mean, I've seen it done with, literary fiction as well, or fiction that's not specifically genre. Like Richard Price is somebody who's very good at, writing stories in which he portrays people who are clearly racist, but they have like the kind of racists who are aware they're racist and are kind of self-loathing, like they're like cops who know they don't see black folks as fully human and are kind of disgusted by it, but can't get away from it and wrestle with it. And and I find that fascinating, but you have to be willing to divorce yourself from this idea that it's all one way or the other, that racists have horns, and that no, these are people who do have more to them than just the awful thing about them. And that is how, if you have the patience, in some cases they can be saved. They can be turned around, and maybe not totally, but or even if they can't be saved, that they can sometimes surprise you by doing, by showing depth and showing self-awareness that you wouldn't expect them to have, or by changing over time.
Right. I can jump in real quick. But I think what you're describing, Matt, is emblematic of the power, patting you on the back here, of a text like Lovecraft, because and adjacent text, which is making the rounds in a grand fashion right now, is the book How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi. And I did start that the other night, and it's interesting because, he talks about, you're either racist or anti-racist, as in there's not like a neutral sort of setting that
Mm.
you're just like, oh, I'm not racist. Okay, well, we are all benefiting on a certain level from
Sure.
racist systems and ideologies, however sharp or pronounced our horns are, to use your metaphor there. But something that I love about something like Lovecraft is once you start reading it as a consumer, in our case, you start to recognize, wow, I don't, and it was very similar. So it makes sense that these are in conversation with each other with Get Out. Once you start reading it and you recognize, oh, I don't know that I've ever either done the work to seek out, much less, but even more than that, read something where the point of view character or characters aren't close to and or just like me. And that's a really powerful sort of mechanism to help reframe us, to start to, and it's the work of, I think, kind of crafts folks and artists in general, is the best version of it is you develop some form of empathy. You're able to, whether it's not assign moral judgment to a character who might be reprehensible and try to say, okay, well, there's something there, but it's also the ability to say, okay, this person who is definitively in all the ways that kind of matter, not like me. And so because of engaging their story, I gain a sense of, kind of their place, their understanding of their own self in the world. And significantly, the story in the book of Ruby and Hillary.
Yeah.
And I remember, and there's a running gag on The Fear of God of how, like, sometimes I can offer a thing really profound, and then occasionally I'm like, oh, I'm really just dense. Reading that chapter, I was like, how do I feel about this? And because for those of you who haven't read it yet, again, we're in spoiler territory. This character, Ruby, who is African-American woman, encounters a character who gifts her with this serum that turns her into a white woman whom she dubs Hillary. And so it's this kind of, but it wasn't, and this is what I meant by my ignorance, it wasn't until the characters explicitly are talking about Jekyll and Hyde that I was like, oh, okay, that's pretty cool.
Yeah. And I mean, well, and the other thing about that, obviously, is that on some level, it's a metaphor for passing, but Ruby is specifically a dark-skinned Black woman, the kind of person for whom passing would never realistically be an option, which makes it all the more tempting that, and again, it's a weird inversion of the Jekyll and Hyde story, where with Jekyll became Hyde so that he could sin with impunity, whereas Ruby becomes Hillary just so she can, walk down the street and not be bothered.
Right.
She can basically go anywhere and do anything.
But that's also a really powerful sort of technique as it's utilized in this book to help those of us who are white and can walk down the street with zero sort of, altercation, realize, oh my gosh, okay, wow. And I don't know, I just really love how it utilizes that genre overlap to really illustrate something pretty profound. Not that, you're going for metaphor symbolism left and right, but the ability.
No, but I won't say no to it if it shows up. But I mean, the thing for me is, I've always liked using, that's the other thing I like about fiction, is it does let me write about people who are different from me. And I love trying to create psychologically realistic portraits of other folks. So that's one of the common threads in my otherwise very different novels, is I like doing that. And, and the other thing too, is fiction generally allows you to explore thoughts and feelings that would be, including really dark feelings that would be untenable in any other medium. You couldn't do them, you wouldn't want to mess around with them in real life. But if you want to try and get into the head of, I don't know, even a concentration camp commandant or something like that, that's part of what fiction can let you do, is sort of, how would it make sense to want to be that person, or what would lead you to those choices? And, maybe get some insight out of something like that, or,
So the kind of branching off from that, but I don't want to leave the, I don't want to leave this conversation without pointing out. So I went in, as I had mentioned before, into your book pretty blind. I knew before I started it that it was basically, okay, Lovecraft Country. I'm assuming there's going to be some H.P. Lovecraft elements that are in play. And I had heard, just because of some of the recommendations and in conversations with Blake and everything, that it was also dealing with, basically racial injustice and racist social norms in the 1950s. But then I get about like 2 pages into your book, and you've got me. I mean, you like a hook, line, sinker, because Atticus is sitting there reading like the Martian Chronicles. Like you're dropping like Ray Bradbury stuff. And so I'm a very, very big, and I'm going to set you up for something that you either are familiar with, and maybe it was intentional, and if not, then okay, great, yay, happy surprise. So I'm a very, very big Ray Bradbury fan, up there with Stephen King. Those are like my two folks, are Ray Bradbury and Stephen King. And Ray Bradbury, fortunately, before he passed away, I had the opportunity to meet a couple of times at a few book signings and things. And at one time through the library, even had the chance to kind of spend half a day with him and talk with him and pick his brain.
That must have been great.
Oh, it was unreal. It was unreal. But he had, and Atticus is reading Martian Chronicles, and I knew when he then arrives, and I did not write this name down, so forgive me, but when he arrives at the home of the man who kind of puts him up for the night on his journey, and
I'm blanking on that name too now, but yeah, I know.
And then the man gives him Dark Carnival, like to read, and I was like, okay, Matt Ruff is either a deep cut Ray Bradbury fan, or he has done his homework, because I was like, Dark Carnival is not the easy go-to of something you mentioned. So I'm curious about your Ray Bradbury crossover.
I mean, it was a little of both. I mean, I am a big Bradbury fan, but I tended to favor his novels.
Yeah, sure.
And Martian Chronicles is kind of an in-between. It is another example of an episodic. I mean, it's all
right.
It's ultimately one story. And I think I was specifically, one of the reasons I picked that one is there is a story in there about Southern blacks going to Mars,
up in the middle
because
of the air. Yes.
Yeah, because they just want to get the hell out, and the white folks trying to stop them from going, because they're like, wait a minute, you're not allowed to leave us.
Right.
Wow.
So that crossover, and I apologize, I'm super excited.
Fine.
So, but that crossover, because I was thinking, so here I am sitting there reading the first chapter of your book, and I'm like, oh, Ray Bradbury and Martian Chronicles. And then to your point, Martian Chronicles he wrote Martian Chronicles as a series of short stories that then they were like, oh, you want to write a novel? And he was kind of like, well, I don't feel like writing a novel. Why don't I just put these all together, sort of link them thematically, and then that'll be my novel, which kind of worked. But it has that story in it that was censored in a couple of editions. That
really, I didn't know that, but I'm not surprised. But
that Way in the Middle of the Air was censored in a couple of editions because it blatantly uses, and in proper context, because it's about a severely racist white supremacist, but he uses the N-word repeatedly. And because Martian Chronicles is frequently read and studied in school, some of the editions remove just that story, and just sort of excise it. And I have 2 editions, one that contains the story and one that doesn't contain the story. But what I found so interesting about the connection there is that in that story, he, this white supremacist is like trying to keep them from going to Mars, where they have a hope for a new life and where people won't see that everybody will be sort of on level playing field. And he is actively trying to stop them from doing that. And one of the characters, like, kind of verbally spits in his face and be like, what are you going to do when we're all gone, when we've all moved on from this? How are you going to spend your time when you can't hunt down people of our color and decimate our lives? Like, how are you going to spend your time? It's a pretty powerful little story. But to pivot back into Lovecraft Country, I'm not going to skip to the end because I think there's a lot of cool things in the middle that I'd like to get into, but I did sort of get this sense towards the end of the piece, particularly in the epilogue and just the reflections of this family as they're kind of thinking through things and looking to a better future, looking to a better tomorrow. And of course, my brain firing off the way it is, I'm like, okay, we start with some Bradbury and Martian Chronicles and a new horizon, a new tomorrow, and then now here with this, it feels very much, and Nathan and I discussed this a bit off pod, feels very much like Lovecraft Country, of course, talking about this horrific condition that so many people experience going through just modern America. And it's not this, fictionalized Artem Lovecraft Country place, but this is actually a present reality with things. But for the potential hope that maybe there's, if you want to say this, like a land beyond this, like maybe through conversations, through, evolution of human experience or whatever, that there could be this sort of horizon that we come to where some of these are left behind. And I just would love to hear some thoughts on that approach to the story. Or
yeah, certainly that was the long-term hope. But what fascinated me was I think one of the triggers that got me thinking about the story was learning about the Green Book and that there was this whole sort of today largely forgotten infrastructure for navigating the realities of legalized racism. It's like, yes, the ultimate goal. And if you ever look at it, a copy of the Green Book, he's got lots of hopeful messages about, the day is coming soon when you won't need this guide anymore and everyone's going to be treated equal. But in the meantime, here are the tools to get through your day. And that sort of combination of optimism about the future, hopefully the near future, but definitely the medium future, combined with a more practical reality is like, for now, you still need to figure out where you can go and where you can't. And here are some tools to help you do that. That sort of fascinated me, that sort of, again, because it was a way, first of all, it was something I had never heard of before and had not really thought about, but that, there were not just guidebooks, but if you were Black, you couldn't join most professional organizations. So they created this sort of parallel universe of professional organizations. There was a Black Freemasons, there was a Black Elks, Black Realtors. And all of that is just a way of getting through the next day. And so, while still striving for a point when they could just forget about all this stuff.
Yeah,
and
right.
So what I was definitely trying to end on was this I couldn't have them live happily ever after because they were going to wake up the next day still in America. So it was going to, the hopeful note is just that having spent time with these characters, now that they're ready for whatever comes next. They'll at least have a fighting chance. And because we live in the future, that the Civil Rights Act is coming, not the next day or the next year, but eventually, and then, more struggle after that, obviously, but it does get better. And we're in a sense still on that point, but
right.
But it would have been false to make it, super hopeful and happy, but it was more like, it's going to be tough, but we're tougher and we're smart and we have each other. And that was, again, a way to be honest, but not crush the reader. Sure.
Well, that's like, and one of my favorite stories, so I enjoyed all of them, but there were two particularly that just sort of, just lit my imagination ablaze. And one of them was actually the Letitia in the home story, Dreams of the Witch House. And if memory serves me, again, my knowledge of Lovecraft, of H.P. Lovecraft's catalog is not as robust as, say, my knowledge of Bradbury's catalog or stuff like that. But if memory serves, wasn't there a story called Dreams of the Witch House, WITCH, that he wrote? And so one of the things I loved about that, and I'd like you to talk about the genesis of that story in general, but to the point you just made, going to be tough, but we're tougher. I just loved Letitia's character, and the fact that even here you have Ruby, who's another character that I really found very endearing, but she's like, nope. I'm like, bye. Like the hauntings start happening and she's like, peace, I'm out. But Letitia is very sort of, she's tougher than what's up against. And ultimately kind of, in her way, kind of wins over the house, kind of, basically takes ownership of all of that. And I found that really compelling. So I'd like you to just sort of unpack that story, its genesis a bit, and Letitia as a character maybe in general.
So initially I had actually imagined that story for an older woman, the idea that it would be maybe Atticus's grandmother or his Aunt Ophelia, who is mentioned but never actually appears in the novel.
Sure, right.
Someone whose husband had just died and had some insurance money and wanted to buy her dream house. And of course that would mean in Chicago, finding a way to buy a property in a white neighborhood, and which is, was complicated because the Supreme Court had basically, ruled that there were these covenants that basically said you could not sell or rent to Black folks, and those were eventually ruled unenforceable in court, that because it was unconstitutional for the state to discriminate, and in order to enforce them, you needed a state court to enforce the prohibition. They basically said, yeah, you can agree not to sell, you can sign these agreements, but you can't sue if someone violates them. It was a weird way to sort of thread the needle. But people could still discriminate voluntarily. So, and they would do that because if you sold to a black family, you'd better be prepared for all your neighbors to hate you. So often what you would have to do is you would have to hire a white person to act as a representative and buy the house for you. And there were cases I read about where people would buy their dream house, but they never actually saw the inside of it until the day they took possession. And then the first thing they did, even before unpacking, would be to call the police and let them know, hey, we're a black family. We've just moved into this white neighborhood. We need you to make sure our neighbors don't kill us tonight.
Wow.
And very often, by the next day, there'd be signs up in every other window in the house saying, undesirables must, at such and such address must leave. We want them out. And so it took real courage to do that. The other problem that you faced was that if you were black, you generally couldn't get a mortgage because they would not, what is it? I forget which government agency, but they would not insure mortgages in mixed race or black neighborhoods or neighborhoods that were likely to become black. So you either had to buy the house with cash, which almost nobody can afford, or you would do a purchase on contract where it's basically rent to own. It's similar to a mortgage in that you pay a big down payment and then have monthly payments. The difference is you have no equity. You don't own the house until it's completely paid off. And if you miss a payment or something else goes wrong, they don't foreclose. They just evict you and keep all the money you've paid them. So, and basically, so this became a scam where realtors would buy up, hundreds of houses and they would sell them on contract at deceptively simple terms. And they would basically rig the game so that you would almost be guaranteed to go into default, and they could sell the same house over and over and over again, collecting a new down payment each time. And I think the estimate was something like the scam was taking $1 million a day out of, at the height of the purchase on contract, $1 million a day were being siphoned out of the black community by these properties. And the fact that people, knowing that the game was rigged, would still choose to buy houses on these terms tells you how desperate they were to just buy a nice big house. And so I'd had this idea of initially of having an older woman with money do this. And the problem was I didn't know what that character was going to do during the rest of the novel. And then I had this other problem too of I didn't know what Letitia's story was going to be. And I also, there were things I needed her to do in the opening story, like her decision to tag along all the way to Artem rather than stay with her brother. I wasn't sure why she would be so hell-bent to do that. And what I eventually realized is, I came up with this idea that, okay, what if it's Letitia who buys the house, not this older woman? And I'm like, okay, well, that could work. And that makes it easier to integrate that story into the larger arc of the novel. But then I'm like, okay, but where's she going to get the money? And then, well, I knew her father had been a professional gambler. So I'm like, well, what if she gets a surprise bequest supposedly from her late father, like somebody owes him a gambling debt. And of course, we later find out the money is actually coming from somewhere else entirely, somebody who wants her to have this house. But, and I'm like, okay, yeah, that's cool. And then, and then I realized that, well, because the opening chapter takes place early in the story, maybe the reason she's going to visit her brother early on is because she wants to borrow money for some scheme. And, her brother is the kind, he's dealt with Letitia before and he's not going to lend her any money. And then I thought to myself, well, what if Letitia, I knew Letitia was religious, and I'm like, what if Letitia is the kind of religious person who sees God as like her co-conspirator and facilitator, somebody who something good happens, it's because God wants to do me a favor and I need something, God will find a way to get it for me. And so, and one thing about that kind of person is that if they, they often believe that, well, sometimes God wants them to do something for him before he does something for you. And so I came up with this idea that Letitia needs money. And so she's going to convince herself that the favor God wants from her to get what she needs is to help Atticus with his goal. Even though there's really no reason for her to tag along to Artemis, she's decided, yeah, this is what I'm going to do. And God's going to do me my favor. And just figuring that out right away helped me realize more about what kind of character she was, that she was, I'd already figured out she was this kind of an operator. She's a physically small woman with a big personality. And part of that's just the way she's wired, but part of it is because she's the youngest kid in a family of 3, that they don't have a lot. And she would have learned early on that to get her fair share, she was going to have to speak up early and often. And so, if she'll sweet talk if she can, she'll try to intimidate you if she can. If she can't do that, she's going to go around you. So, and that plus the idea of like, oh, she'll get this idea in her head that she's coming along on this trip and God has a plan. And part of that plan is she's going to help Atticus with his thing. And then God's going to help her with the next step of her life. And lo and behold, she gets back to Chicago, money comes out of nowhere. And then she's like, yeah, so I'm going to buy my dream house and I'm going to go for something. And even after it becomes clear that, yeah, this is way too good to be true. And the house is haunted and the neighbors are going to hate her and it's going to go through hell. And it's like, it's not just solipsism. It's like, it's actually a survival strategy. If you're a Black woman alone facing this, it's like, even though you're going to lose everything if you leave, because you're buying on contract, you're locked in, you don't get your money back. Still, it's like, at least get out alive. But if you can convince yourself that God wants me to have this God gave me this chance, then you're not alone. And that'll give you the moral courage to do what you need to do to make it work. And that's how she pulls it off. And Ruby's not a part of this.
Right.
Useful self-delusion. So Ruby's like, fine, you and God can stay in the house. I'm going back home.
She's like, bye.
I'll come visit, if the place is not a burning heap of coal in a month.
Right.
Yeah.
No, that's great. I really did. I mean, like I said, I enjoyed every story for its own unique adventure, but that one really stood out to me. Nathan, I've talked a lot and probed a lot. Do you have any sort of I have like a couple more. I know we don't want to go on forever, but I want to give you an opportunity if you have anything specific you want to highlight or sort of unpack or prompt a little bit.
Yeah, I think for me, as far as the stories within the book, 2 that really jumped out at me, and we can spend as much or as little time on them as we want. But one is Hippolyta and Ida on the off planet, right?
Yeah.
And there was just something so wild about that. Again, if you think as a reader unfamiliar with the text before going into it, you're still trying to acclimate to what structurally is happening. And also I just loved, is it Scylla? The monster
on the beach. Yeah.
There was something, and Reed, I think this will echo for you, and Matt, I don't know if you've read King's Dark Tower series, but there was something very lobstrosity about that sequence.
I probably had, I've read that story, and I'm sure I had it somewhere in the back of my mind as I was physically setting up the space. The fact that, there's a doorway on the beach.
Yes.
And there's a cliff overhead.
Drawing of the 3 type of visuals. Yeah. I really loved that. And also it really strangely, and again, these, I don't know if we would technically call this epiphany, but these things that are now connecting in my brain, but it had an echo of Dr. Manhattan on Mars from Watchmen that really, I don't know.
It's interesting. I mean, for me, the other thing, obviously, there's a bit of a nod to Alien, and that one of the baby Scylla she ends up taking back with her turns into a face hugger and kills her. That was, Hippolyta is like the first character who you have not actually met before I tell the story, and so I needed to grab you right away. And in some ways, she's sort of a way of capturing my own mother's, I did not have a Black mother, but my mom was someone who, she grew up in South America, mostly. She was born in Brazil, grew up in Argentina at a time when women were not encouraged to seek higher education. Like it was the Perón era. And So she was an incredibly intelligent woman, spoke 4 languages fluently and could get along in a half dozen others. But because she didn't have a college degree, I think there's a part of her always felt that at least other people would see her as stupid. And she never really found her niche in life. You know, she would talk about that one of the reasons she was so supportive of my career was just this feeling that, you know, I knew what I wanted to do and I had my dream and she was going to support that. And Hippolyta's tendency to go for long drives is something my mother did a lot too. She's absolutely the kind of person who would drive out to the middle of the woods if she thought there was something interesting there in the middle of the night. So yeah, I'd had this idea that I would have Hippolyta find out about this weird observatory that turned out to be more than an observatory. It was actually a way to go to other planets, and that she would be drawn to it. And I had to very quickly, because I only had about 10,000 words to play with, introduce her and give enough of her backstory so that you would understand why it was so important to her, and why, even after she realized what she had found, she would not run away, but would take that step through the door and risk, you know, whatever was there. Yeah, I really loved her character. And I don't remember now how like her whole thing is like, she comes of age in the 1930s, and this is when Pluto was discovered, and all these kids wrote in to the Lowell Observatory with suggestions of what it should be named. And there's this whole thing where she comes up with the idea of calling it Pluto, and writes in her suggestion. And of course, what actually happened is this British girl who had a family connection to another astronomer, she came up with Pluto as well. And so she kind of got to jump the line.
Sure.
They gave her credit for it, but it's like, it's not like her letter got there first. It's just, she had a family connection, which Hippolyta, as a little black kid in Harlem, could, you know, she's got nobody to call. So she's heartbroken that they picked the name she wanted, but it's credited to somebody else. And she realizes, oh, I never had a chance. And she becomes obsessed with the idea of finding a planet and getting to name it herself. And that's part of what drives her as an adult to, oh, I found a planet. Portal. Yeah.
Right.
And I get to go.
That's awesome. Well, I really love her.
Yeah.
And especially as the book develops and her relationship to Horace. But another one, and it, you know, none of them are quote unquote lesser, but it feels a bit more adjacent ultimately, but a story that I found real, just fascinating was Atticus and Montrose and the Henry Narrow
the Narrow House
subplot. And one thing I just really loved about it is, in the moment, it feels, at least it did to me, like a swerve. You know, you're totally anticipating them finding this guy, and while on a certain level they do, by no means is it in the manner in which you would have expected. But I also just loved kind of the sense of this atemporal whatever that Henry and I can't remember the wife's name, but that he and his wife and the child, Pearl, is that right?
Pearl, yeah.
Pearl and the child live in. And I don't know, I really loved that sort of side plot, and wonder if you have any sort of lingering thoughts you want to share on it.
So with that, the thing was, having mentioned that these folks were from Tulsa, I wanted somehow to incorporate the Tulsa Massacre into the novel. And I didn't have a story for Montrose. And another thing I really wanted to do at some point was explain why Montrose became the person he is, the father he is. Like Montrose, the key to Montrose is he's the kind of dad who doesn't care whether his kid likes him. He doesn't want to be your friend. He's your dad. And his job is to keep you safe as much as possible and give you the tools so that after he's gone, you won't get yourself killed stupidly. And Atticus is the kind of kid who doesn't listen and, you know, is constantly doing, like, he joins the army and goes and fights a war for white people, which is the stupidest thing that, you know, Montrose could think to do. And Montrose is just furious that his kid is just not listening to him. And I wanted to sort of explain how he came to be who he was. And so, and this is another one of the sort of Matt Ruff non sequiturs where it's like, yeah, so what does it have to do with the dead guy? And I had this idea that they would go in search of these notebooks that Caleb Braithwaite wanted, that were stolen by this son of this other sorcerer. And, you know, last known location was somewhere in Southern Illinois. And so they go there looking for him. And what it turns out is that the guy and he ran off with the black maid, and they had a kid together and moved into this neighborhood. And this kid was completely naive. This white guy was completely naive about the peril he was in. The whole family ended up getting murdered essentially by the local clan. And yeah, so basically they're dead, and Atticus and Montrose get there, but they're dead, but they're trapped in this afternoon and evening of the day that they were murdered. And so
it was wild.
Montrose gets there, and sort of it's winter, but then he falls down this hill, and he's sort of trapped on this border between winter and this endless summer day, and decides to go in the house, and he's doing this because he wants to get Braithwaite out of their life to protect his son. That's the only reason he does this. And ends up sitting down, and the thing is that to Nero, who's dead, it's like the dead they've lost pretty much the ability to feel anything. There's no taste in the food. And so what Nero basically says is, I will give you what you want, but you've got to make me feel something. And he wants, what he turns out to want is, he wants the story of the day that Montrose's father was murdered, the night that Montrose's father was murdered. And that prompts Montrose to basically go back in time and tell the story of the jumping off of the Tulsa massacre, and how his father was shot carrying him to safety. And so it is definitely, it's a weird, it's a ghost story, but really it's a story about, this is, the dead want you to share their pain so they can be alive again for a moment, and about different fathers and sons and their relationships. And by the time it's done, you sort of get what moves Montrose, and why he doesn't care if Atticus is his friend, if only Atticus will just, start showing some sense and stop just running off to the graveyard every other,
Well, it's funny because, like I mentioned earlier today, when I went to actually do a little self-educating on the series, Reed, I don't know if you saw this, but Michael K. Williams plays Montrose, and I was like, "Oh my god, that's perfect."
Yeah, it's perfect.
Perfect.
That was a case of the dream coming true, because he would have been on my short list, but I'm like, Michael K. Williams, they're never going to get him. But
so good.
Turns out when you're on HBO and he's part of the family, so it's no longer as insane an idea.
No, that's awesome. Well, we're going to be sort of narrowing down and winding home here in just a few moments, but I have one more thing I want to talk about, sort of through the context of another story that really stood out to me, and that's Jekyll in Hyde Park. The story, of course, where Ruby wakes up and discovers that she's a white woman, and it's because a couple of just sort of logistic notes, and yes, there's an HBO series coming out. I don't know exactly how they're going to handle these twists, but I loved the fact,
don't either.
Right? It's I loved the fact that two big things in that story. So first of all, obviously that the white man she's talking to, that she kind of gets affectionate with, and then when he introduces himself and it's Caleb, I'm like, I didn't, because you just don't automatically know that. But then that she becomes Hillary, and she spends so much of this time as Hillary, and then you later find out, oh crap, that's Dell. she's been basically embodying Dell, and I loved that reveal so much.
There's a thing I like to do in novels, is to take a character you expect to be the protagonist and kill them off in the opening, or take a character you expect to be a minor character and make them one of the most important people in the story. And that's actually kind of a double embodiment of that, because Dell too, you don't expect to see her again, and then it turns out, no, she's got a big role here. And and Ruby likewise. At first, she's just she's just Letitia's sister who doesn't want to stay in the house, and later you find out, well, no, part of what the point of this is, I had made an early decision that I was going to tell everything from the point of view of the black characters. I was not going to get in any white person's head, because I wanted to stick with the people for whom, the horrors of racism really were a horror. I didn't want to do I didn't want to have the white friend, or even the white sympathetic villain, and, get in his head. So I needed a way to show what the villain's master plan was when they, what were they doing when they were talking and thought they could speak freely. And eventually I realized, well, what if I take Ruby, who's kind of on the periphery of these other characters, and I give her this opportunity to be white and make her, so basically, yeah, to basically have Braithwaite basically hired her to be his sort of spy, where she could be either, you know, the black woman who no one will pay attention to, or this, you know, pretty good looking redhead who they will underestimate. And so she can do what he needs done when he can't be there himself. And what does that do to her? And, you know, and what is she, you know, and again, this is like, she's not somebody who can just pass. So he's offering her this ticket to do something, to just pick your dream job and actually have a chance of getting it. And of course she's going to discover that, you know, white women have limitations of what they can do too, but at least the horizons are somewhat broader. And all she's got to do is learn to live with the fact that, yeah, there's this other real woman in the basement in this glass coffin in a coma who's trapped there. And yeah, she only, and this creepy thing that Braithwaite says is that, yeah, well, you know, she dreams, you know, she dreams whatever you're doing. So the only life she has left is you. And of course, part of what's going on is, at least a little bit, Braithwaite and Ruby are kind of having an affair. And so it's kind of, if you take time to think about that. So you're saying that, yeah, when I have sex with you, she's dreaming about that. And
wow.
I want to live with that? It's like, yeah, yeah, maybe she enjoys the part where I'm out walking in the sunshine and the birds are tweeting, but you know, what about the other stuff I'm doing, or it's stuff that she just doesn't want? And
well, her transformation on the elevator, I was like, oh my gosh, you know, it was a real hard turn. Like, whoa.
Well, that's the other thing. Yeah. It's like her clothes do not magically transform with her. So, and Ruby's a big gal. So her, you know, Dell's shoes don't fit her. Dell's bra isn't big enough. And so, yeah. So going forward, she's probably going to either have to time the end of the potion much better, or get clothes that are elastic,
can accommodate.
Like Hulk's purple pants. You know?
Yeah, exactly.
Some unstable molecules.
And I love the final line of that one, which of course has resonance in a number of different ways. But you know, and it ends basically with Braithwaite asking her, like, who do you want to be? Like, what's your decision? And so, as sort of a final coda, and then I'll have a final question for you, and then we'll wrap this up. As a final coda, like, one of the things we've gone to a number of different places. Listeners, if you for some reason are still on the fence about whether or not to check out Lovecraft Country, good God's sake, like, check out the book. You're gonna have a great time. It's fascinating. It very much is sort of a binge-able reading experience, and you know, episodic in nature. So there's a lot of variety in the stories, but a lot of thematic sort of threads that tie everything together. But one of my favorite lines from this, and maybe this will be a nice place to sort of tie everything together, is one of the things that he's told. I think George Barry says it. I didn't write down who says it, but I believe it's George Barry says to Atticus that, you know, that stories are like people, that loving them doesn't make them perfect. And God, I loved that line. That we've talked a lot. That seems
to be a favorite for readers to quote.
Yeah. I mean, and so let me jump right in with everybody else, because I was like, I feel like there's so much truth and resonance in just that idea. Like, you know, loving it doesn't make it perfect. And it doesn't have to be perfect to love it. And there's all kinds of complexities to, you know, the ramifications of that idea. But I think what I so appreciated about the characters in this book and each of its different stories is the way it balanced out. Like, these are not monolithic in their intentions. They're not monolithic in their, you know, their frailties or their quandaries. They feel very real as people. So kudos and congratulations to
thank you.
Your imaginative capacity, because they definitely feel very complex as entities within the story. And so I've got a kind of a two-part question that you can speak to, and then we'll say goodbye. So first of all, and this is the biggest part, I always like when creatives get on our show to give them an opportunity. If there's something that in the variety of interviews you've done that you don't frequently get to talk about, but you always want to talk about, or you like mentioning or highlighting, if there's something that you'd like to take a moment or two to just say, you know what, nobody asks me about this, and I love talking about this, or I find this interesting. I want to give you a beat to be able to discuss that. And then just in the end, I kind of just want your overall summation of what you want what your ideal would be for readers engaging this. Is it obviously you want them to be entertained, obviously you want it to be thought-provoking, but is there anything particular that you want them to sort of walk away with in terms of your intentions and hopes for their experience of it?
Well, so to take the second part first, I mean, I'm generally not a message guy. I think that, again, yeah, the most important thing is to tell an engaging story. And I find that I do better, I tell better stories when I don't try to underscore, some specific message, to trust the reader to figure it out for themselves and just let, the message and the resonances develop organically in the storytelling. And
sure.
And the other thing too, when you're talking about race in particular, it's like even the most matter of fact, dry recitation of racist history will be heard by some readers as an accusation. And so if you push that any harder, it's like you're already going to have a hard time, with people just saying, hey, I had nothing to do with this. Why are you bringing up all this stuff? And why can't we just be friends and enjoy history? And it's like, guy, I'm just telling you what happened in Tulsa. I'm not saying you set the neighborhood on fire yourself, and
right.
So I find it's better to just, I obviously because I am my own first reader, I'm seeing possible themes and messages as I'm going, and some of that feeds back into the writing, but I try not to dictate what people take away from it. I really like to leave that up to them. And I don't know, in terms of, I don't know that there's a specific thing I've really wanted to be asked about it, but I guess one thing, just bouncing off what you just said about the difference between the characters, and this is something worth highlighting, that one of the advantages of writing an ensemble cast like this, like very often the way diversity is done, I think, is that you'll have like one representative character from each, group, like you have the black character and the problem with that is that they become, whether you want them or not, they often tend to become monolithic embodiments of, the group. And so it unless you're very good at not thinking too much about critical reaction, there's a temptation to, like, if you've got like the one Muslim character, to make sure that they're not too bad or not too good, that you're sort of not insulting anybody. And
right.
If you have, if everybody in the story is black or Muslim or whatever, then they have room to breathe and be individuals, and they don't have to carry the moral weight for the representation of their whole class. And they end up being more like just ordinary, real individuals, which I think is, to the extent that Lovecraft Country works, that's the thing. I wasn't, approaching any of the characters as a black character, a generic representative of the black experience. It's like, no, you've got Atticus, you've got his father, you've got his uncle, who, they're half brothers, but they're very, very different. And
sure.
You got Ruby and Letitia, again, very different. And so, and even specific situations in the novel, like, if you plugged somebody else in and had them face the same thing, the way they dealt with it would likely be very different. And so that's how I'm able to not worry about, like, yes, Ruby's reaction, like she doesn't immediately say, well, of course, I'm not going to exploit this woman, who's in the glass coffin. It's like, no, well, I know this is wicked. I know what I should do, but, I really like being a white person and the freedom that gives me. And that's the thing, is like, you can be honest about the temptations and the struggles that people face and have them be human without fearing that that's somehow racist, that, that's this weird trap. And I think this is where white authors in particular can have trouble. If you're just having the one white, the one black character, it's like, oh, don't want to give them some nasty trait that will be interpreted as me slandering, black folks. It's like, no. And once you've done that, it's like, once you're comfortable with that, then, you could write a solitary character and not worry about it. But I think particularly for folks who have not done this before, just having a group of folks where you can see them as a community, as individuals, and not not worry about what it says about you, that, you know, a particular character does something stupid or vicious. That can really lead to a better story overall. So I guess that would be a little something to carry away if you're thinking about this yourself and you're a writer and you're wondering how to approach it and we're worried that you'll screw it up.
Yeah.
So
well, awesome. Well, Matt, we can't thank you enough for taking so much time out of your evening.
Oh no, this was a great pleasure. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Oh gosh, yeah. We hope you felt.
What's that shirt you got on there, Matt?
Oh yes, let me.
Whoa, Matt Ruff.
We never met a shameless plug we didn't love.
No, and absolutely,
it's true. But we hope you felt welcomed and felt at home here. We'd love to have you back.
I did very much. Thank you.
So
yes, and I'm happy to come back.
Awesome. Yeah, we'd love to have you back. So listeners, not only check out the book Lovecraft Country, but tune in next week to find out who won the drawing. Because our wonderful new friend of the show, Matt Ruff, has been graciously willing to autograph a copy of the book for you. So don't forget about that, and we will be announcing who the winner of that is next week. Matt, I just thank you so much again for being here. Where can they find you and all the stuff that's going on in your world if they're interested?
So the website is www.bymattruff.com. That's BY like a byline. And the reason I have that one is because I did not listen to my mother-in-law when she told me to grab mattruff.com, because I said, who else could possibly have that name? And turns out a lot of people, including, I think he's a Christian broadcaster down in Tennessee who got there before me a couple months. So
Wow.
I am bymattruff.com, the byline. So.
Awesome. Bymattruff.com. And yes, listeners, tune in next week. We are going to be starting Season 2 of The Leftovers. We are going to be starting our next phase of that whole wonderful, mysterious journey where we do everything we can to let the mystery be. And as always on this show, we encourage you, because the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom, but not the end of the conversation. In that spirit, we encourage you to fear nothing else and be on your way rejoicing. We'll see you next time, everybody.
See you, everybody.
Take it easy. Thanks.